But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Welcome to episode number 13 of the Exit Your Matrix show. I'm glad you're here. So we're going to continue with our reading from Lysander Spooner's Vices Are Not Crimes, A Vindication of Moral Liberty. This is section 5. Vices are usually pleasurable, at least for the time being, and often do not disclose themselves as vices, by their effects, until they have been practiced for many years, perhaps for a lifetime. To many, perhaps most, of those who practice them, they do not disclose themselves as vices at all during life. Virtues, on the other hand, often appear so harsh and rugged, they require the sacrifice of so much present happiness, at least, and the results, which alone prove them to be virtues, are often so distant and obscure, in fact, so absolutely invisible to the minds of many, especially of the young, that, from the very nature of things, there can be no universal or even general knowledge that they are virtues. In truth, the studies of profound philosophers have been expended, if not wholly in vain, certainly with very small results, in efforts to draw the lines between virtues and the vices. If then it became so difficult, so nearly impossible in most cases, to determine what is and what is not vice, and especially if it be so difficult, in nearly all cases, to determine where virtue ends and vice begins. And if these questions, which no one can really and truly determine for anybody but himself, are not to be left free and open for experiment by all, each person is deprived of the highest of all his rights as a human being, to wit, his right to inquire, investigate, reason, try experiments, judge, and ascertain for himself what is to him virtue and what is to him vice. In other words, what, on the whole, conduces to his happiness and what, on the whole, tends to his unhappiness. If this great right is not to be left free and open to all, then each man's whole right, as a reasoning human being, to, quote, liberty in the pursuit of happiness, is denied him. So we're continuing to delve into mind control, and specifically the first 2 of the 14 techniques that we outlined in the last show. And those are the techniques that are used to accomplish mind control. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about before we get into the topic today that I don't think I spent enough time on, and that is the purpose of the show, the name of the show, etc. So I have spoken about it before. Regardless of the topics we touch on, natural law, morality, which are all critical, I believe really the conditioning of the mind is the most important thing. And so that's why I named the show Exit Your Matrix. And actually the truth is that Exit the Matrix is what I was looking for, but it was already taken. So I ended up with Exit Your Matrix, but it actually worked out really well because I think it fits in nicely with what I have found to be true, and that is that there is a matrix for all of us. I have one, you have one, everybody has one to a certain extent. And that's the combination of all of these indoctrinations and beliefs that we've been given and absorbed basically over time, which for many of us, they're not our own. We just inherited them. But the point being that that is our matrix. So the whole purpose of this show is to challenge your matrix, your specific matrix, whatever it might be. It might be religion or work or military or authority or any number of things, but it's really individual. I don't think that we can watch a movie like The Matrix and see it as a particular thing. I think really what the allegory there is that we all have a matrix, and the idea is to try to push through that and find out and isolate what it actually is and try to improve ourselves and rise in consciousness, understanding that we have those things going on. And another thing I want to stress is you should not believe anything I'm saying. So I'm here to present information that hopefully sparks some interest, that really lights a flame in you to be interested in researching this on your own, which is really what it needs, because I am going over this material very briefly. And in fact, I'm basing it on Mark Passio's work, and each of the shows that I do they average, 30 minutes, close to 50 minutes, maybe an hour. Each one of those is distilled down from a show that he does that takes 2 hours. So that gives you an idea of the depth that he's going into it versus what I'm going into. So please understand that all of this is for you to verify on your own. Do not believe. I'm very critical of beliefs in this, so I'm not going to start with myself and say you should believe me. Do your own research, but hopefully some of the topics here and some of the information I'm giving will make you curious. All right, so let's dive in. The first thing I want to cover is that we essentially have one of two choices in how we learn and how we obtain knowledge and understand how the universe works. And the first way is through the school of hard knocks, for lack of a better term, and that's really to go out and without seeking any independent knowledge of our own or any wisdom, we just go out and start living life. And we'll make some good decisions, and those have certain consequences, and we'll make bad decisions, and those have certain consequences. And we learn that way. But there is another way we can learn, and that is through spending those two forms of personal currency that we have, our time and our attention. Of course, we can pay attention and we spend our time doing things, right? But we can do those things and spend that time and effort on acquiring the knowledge that will prevent us from having those bad experiences and will point us to how to have positive experiences. And then, though we usually tend to take the school of hard knocks approach, right? We get out into the world and we just go through it. How many of you have heard of the terms natural law and things like that? I certainly hadn't until about a year ago, so I've gone a long time without that. So my thought is what do we really do with our time? That time that most of us don't spend acquiring that knowledge and really trying to understand ourselves and the world around us. And it's that endless list that I keep talking about. It's the shopping and the travel and the entertainment and the restaurants and when are we going to go to Disneyland and the next sporting event. But I really want to focus on the fact that I believe, and I think the material is there to prove, that we are co-creators of our experience in two ways. First, co-creating with natural law, and that doesn't happen because we want it to or we ask it to, it just is. But then we're also co-creating in a second way with our fellow human beings. And this is the eternal, and inescapable working of the cosmos. So today we'll be touching on specific examples of acknowledged and documented mind control, specifically to reinforce, to demonstrate that this is always and always will continue to occur, and we'll be continuing that probably over the next 7 weeks or so. So as we explore them, you will have the ability to judge whether and for yourself and to what extent you believe these things are affecting you. In other words, are you under mind control, or is mind control or those techniques impacting you in some way? So before we kick this off and get into the meat of these first two techniques, I did want to ask that you like, subscribe, or what I think is more important than anything, and that is to share. Please share this with somebody, get a conversation going, and see what they have to say about it. But I do appreciate you being here and your support. So to continue from last week, after we listed and gave a brief description of the 14 techniques of mind control, this today will be the first of several discussions where we're diving into the detail of how mind control is accomplished. And recall from the last episode that the principles of mind control lie in basically three major categories, but four items. The first is words, which take the form of sound wave energy that are manifested by our physiology, by our vocal cords, etc. The second is colors, and these take the form of light wave energy that we can access and that contain information that we can decode. The third and the fourth are in the same category because they are form energy, and they operate through archetypes, and these are shapes and symbols. So as I said, my plan is to cover 2 of these techniques over each of the next 7 episodes or so, we'll see. But I'm pretty sure we can accomplish that. So the first technique of mind control that we're going to talk about today is obfuscation. Now it's important to understand that obfuscation highlights the importance of mind control and the principle of words. One of the biggest lessons has been and continues to be the value you derive from truly understanding and being curious about the language that is being used, the specific words. And I can tell you, this has definitely been the case for me as I've started, I think, a real awakening, and I'm starting to pay attention to words and the meaning of words and how the meaning of words and the definitions are changed over time. So you'd be surprised what you'd learn when you start really paying attention to those critical words, and in particular the ones that are communicated to you. So to me, without question, the best example of this type of confusion is from George Orwell's book 1984, where he said, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." And the technique most responsible for creating fear within us, which we know and experience as confusion, is obfuscation. It's dressing something up to appear as something that is very often its opposite. So how does this happen? It happens through word association, word play, and most of all, repetition. So here is what Joseph Goebbels, I have heard his last name pronounced different ways, Joseph Goebbels, maybe that's the way, but here's what he said. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the moral enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. So what creates chaos and what creates order is what is referred to as natural law principles. So actions and behaviors that are consistent or in harmony with natural law principles create order. And actions and behaviors that are not consistent with or are in violation of natural law principles create chaos. And I want to go back to that quote that I just shared because it contains a very important statement. And it's the part that says, "For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie." And I bring that up because we need to have a solid understanding of solipsism. It's that term that I keep talking about. And that is the belief that the self is the only thing that exists, and as a result, that objective truth cannot be known. This is at the heart of mind control and is absolutely a fundamental factor. The awareness that truth can be known is a cornerstone of the human psyche. For our ability to understand that truth can be known, not just what those truths are. All of the amazing components of our psychological makeup, things like imagination, reason, logic, creativity, discernment, problem solving, conceptual thinking, all of those are conceptual and inaccessible to us in their true forms until we reach the awareness that truth is objective and can be known. Once that happens, all of those amazing capabilities that I just listed, they start to manifest. They come into being. So now that we understand what obfuscation is, what is it that's being obfuscated? So first is the obfuscation of simplicity with complexity. Truths are always elegant and simple. So digging into this, the place that we start is with principles. And a principle is a truth that creates freedom. So how do principles become known? Well, every true thing you have ever learned is a principle. And first principles make up the entirety of natural law. So I would say first principles first, which is the same thing as first things first, which popular culture pays no attention to, right? Because we've been conditioned to value materiality and consumerism, comfort, safety, convenience, money, image, and all those things that we're taught to covet and told will result in our happiness. Second, the obfuscation of principles and laws. Now, I want to take a second here and just say that anytime I'm talking about law versus natural law, if I'm talking about natural law, I'll say natural law. Anytime I say law, I mean man's law, in other words, written laws. What logically and naturally follows from this is that a law must be enforced, because it is a lie. There is no natural mechanism in existence that interacts with laws either through reinforcement or rejection. So reinforcement is an act that is consistent with a law, and rejection is an act that is inconsistent with or violates a law. And again, I'm talking man's law. So I subscribe to this really interesting YouTube channel, which is focused mainly on architectural and geological anomalies that will really blow your mind. It's called John Levi, and you can see it here. But in one of his videos, he refers to the Founding Fathers and their contemporaries as men in tights, which I love, and I've kind of adopted that and modified it to men in tights with fancy pens. And so this is my thinking when I think of laws and man-made laws now that I've heard him refer to the men in tights. And I'm giving due deference to the efforts to organize a free and just arrangement free from the English monarchy's tyranny, and indeed, I have great respect for a great deal of what the Founding Fathers did. The courage it took to do what they did is remarkable and worthy of praise, and it was one of the greatest attempts at moving a people toward freedom and justice. But to think for a moment that what they created and what we have arrived at now was anything other than a step in the right direction is just a display of ignorance, because they didn't make it all the way. And this is just an example of why I say what I just said, and am somewhat critical of the Founding Fathers, even though they did some remarkable things. So this is from James Madison. The man who is possessed of wealth, who lolls on his sofa or rolls in his carriage, cannot judge the wants or feelings of the day laborer. The government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent, but in process of time, when we approximate the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small, through the various means of trade and manufacturers, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections, and unless wisely provided against, what will become of your government? In England, at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place. If these observations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation. Landholders ought to have a share in the government to support these invaluable interests, and to balance and check the other. They ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Now, some have said that statements like this shouldn't overshadow the Founding Fathers and their efforts. But I think that they're actually more important than that, and they are revealing of nature and character. So I completely reject and denounce all actions they took and all laws they passed that were not completely consistent with natural law, which, we'll find out in a minute, were never needed to be written down, because if they were memorializing natural law, they were already in effect in the universe and didn't need to be repeated. But in any case, this also includes every law since that time, and for this very simple reason. It is wrong immoral and unjust for any law to be written which attempts to convey a right to a person or group which you or I don't have as rights ourselves as sovereign beings. So think about it. We would all agree that none of us individually have the right to take from others what doesn't belong to us, unless you're a socialist, of course. Yet, from the overwhelming majority of the populace's place of complete ignorance regarding what morality really is, they foolishly and naively believe that they can beat that truth into submission with notions of the greater good and necessity and habit. It's always been this way. And yes, even democracy, to create the false belief that they can transfer to another party, whether an individual or group, rights which they do not possess themselves. And this is an utter falsehood. So let me use an example. Suppose that all of us listening, and myself included, we all live in a neighborhood. And up on the top of a hill is a landowner, has a big piece of land. We all know, very, very wealthy person. And suppose in the rest of the neighborhood something happens. Let's say there's a flood. And we look up there and he's high and dry, and we know obviously that he has means. So would it be acceptable for us individually to go and to take from him? No. Yet, what we do is organize ourselves, and when we get into a collectivist mindset, we start to justify actions like, well, wait a minute, all of us down here are suffering and we're going through this. He should be doing this, or he should be doing that, or he doesn't have the right to have. And we start thinking in those terms, and that is the genesis of laws. We believe that individually we don't have a right to do something, yet when we get together in a group, we can somehow vote that into morality, and we just can't. So a question, is it possible that while acknowledging that democracy has resulted certainly in the improvement of the human experience and conditions for many people in many ways, with the example I just gave, we aren't forced to acknowledge that democracy is an absolute violation of natural law principles? Do we have the mental dexterity and honesty to recognize these seemingly incompatible concepts? Observation indicates that we don't, but also that we're satisfied with claiming we have the holy grail of democracy and that there is no improvement. The system can't be improved, so shut up and either get back to work or go buy something. So here's another question. What do you believe is the current state of aggregate consciousness, or average consciousness? Is it the manifestation of behavior through the blending of our thoughts and emotions to create the action that we believe is guided by our examination of the morality of that action? Or is it through the desire to avoid the consequences of not obeying? And wouldn't you know that I was listening to something just a couple of days ago that addresses this very point, although with a little different language. So this comes from an investigative journalist and podcaster, and I've mentioned it before, John Rappaport, and he is one of my absolute favorite people. He has 3 programs in addition to tons of other stuff he does. He has 3 programs available for sale that are in his Matrix series. So it's The Matrix Revealed is the first, Exit the Matrix is the second, and Power Outside the Matrix is the third. So I have The Matrix Revealed, the first one, which I can't recommend enough. And here are some excerpts from that really touch on this subject.
Let's take the idea of reward punishment. There is a subtle kind of conditioning that takes place from a very early age in which a person comes to decide that the inputs of either reward or punishment are going to depend on one's conduct, and that therefore one should shape one's conduct in such a way that the rewards outweigh the punishments, or that one should seek to do that which will bring the greatest number of possible rewards as opposed to the least number of possible punishments. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's not a wildly inaccurate calculation. But what happens when a person gets too involved in that scheme, he begins to live his life and carves out his life based on this anticipation and calculation about what shall I do that will bring me rewards and what shall I avoid that might bring me punishments. And that deep, deep, deep involvement makes him into a robot, makes him into a machine.
So what is the motivation for most people's actions? Is it carefully evaluating the principles involved? Is it morality? Or is it fear? Or fear's inbred cousin, the belief in the sanctity of authority? In either case, notice the relationship. If I don't exhibit compliance with authority, what will I face? Now, do you pay your taxes out of feelings of love and gratitude that the state is a benevolent construct vigilantly looking out for your interests? Or is it because you know, because you've seen it, that if you don't, it will use its monopoly on violence and have its order followers steal from you, bankrupt you, and potentially imprison you? Think of it any way you want, but that, my friends, is fear. And is this not an excellent example of obfuscation, morality, and fear? And this distorts our thinking so that we falsely understand morality to be what man claims it to be versus what natural law demonstrates and shows us that it is, what we can observe for ourselves in the world around us. Instead of making your own decision about a course of action based on the inherent composition of your consciousness, the alignment of your thoughts, emotions, and actions, you are threatened with harassment, retaliation, and objectively immoral treatment so that you will comply. And in cases where anyone with a shred of morality, which is actually most people in their native and unindoctrinated state, they know and can clearly see that the action being compelled is wrong. It's men in tights with fancy pens, and it's total BS. And the laws of nature continue to work as they always have, without interruption or interference, and have never been influenced by anything any person asserts to be contrary to it, including any of his laws. So here's a fourth obfuscation, and it's a major one, and that is order out of chaos. Not that any of the other obfuscations that we've talked about make any sense, but this one is pure insanity, because it is thinking that even attempting to exercise authority and control over others will create true order. It's the obfuscation of sovereignty and control. So this is the standard operating procedure of absolutely the vast majority of people. And control breeds fear, and fear is the lowest state of consciousness a human being can make decisions in. The public at large either believes man's laws are moral, or they falsely believe that the behavior the law compels or the rights it claims to bestow are justified. So the fourth obfuscation is that of gnosis and belief. So when we bring our thoughts, emotions, and actions into harmony, that is when we experience sovereignty internally, and when it's adopted and acted upon by large groups of people, we experience that externally in the world as freedom. So let's talk about problems and how we resolve them. The key is always in a proper understanding of the nature of the problem, which is the only means of really addressing it at its root. When the nature of the problem is identified, we can then make a diagnosis. Now, I didn't know this, but it's interesting to take a look at the word diagnosis and its components and its etymology. So we see that dia means through in Greek, and gnosis means knowledge, also in Greek. And it is worth noting that gnosis is a special kind of knowledge because it's the kind that is gained through experience. It's not learned. It must be lived. Therefore, diagnosis means through knowledge. Now let's delve into the word belief And for that, I really think that Mark Passio does a great job of breaking it down. Take a listen.
So what a controller wants to obfuscate gnosis with, direct experiential knowledge, is belief. So the obfuscation of gnosis with belief, this is putting this mask on to the face of true knowledge and getting people to accept something that they do not actually have any experiential knowledge of, and that's called belief. And it's very, very interesting that the word belief, if you break it down, this is known as alchemical language. Words often betray their meanings in the sound, the phonetic pronunciation of the sound of the word itself. Belief. Belief is Bel life. Now, Bel is the name of a sun god of the ancient world, Phoenicia Canis sun god. The Phoenicians worshipped a god known as Bel or Bil. Well, this god represents a sun god, but it is more often associated with a dark aspect of a sun god. Human sacrifice was often done to this god. In the modern day, the biggest one is called war. These same occultists or controllers or manipulators want us to lead a life of belief, named after one of their gods.
Our goal then should be gnosis, knowledge through experience. Hopefully positive, but if we create the conditions, it will be negative. And another obfuscation is individuality and culture. So here's what Terence McKenna said about culture. Culture is not your friend. Culture is for other people's convenience and the convenience of various institutions, churches, companies, tax collection schemes, what have you. It is not your friend. It insults you. It disempowers you. It uses and abuses you. None of us are well treated by culture. In obfuscating individuality and culture, notice that morality is also warped in the process, because it attempts to abandon that governing principle that the individual has been gifted by creation, not another man, but gifted by creation, or the universe, or God, or whatever you want to call it, with what is necessary to act morally. It already resides in us. We don't need to seek it or be told about it from anyone else. So now we're going to move on to the second mind control technique we're going to cover today, and that is worldview poisoning. Our view of our world, ourselves, and our relationship to it must be manipulated in order for us to be controlled. So some examples of that poisoning are ourselves in the world, our value, and human nature in general, and that all of those things must be negative, dark, and limiting. So the goal, ultimately, is for us to spiral into a victim mentality. That's what our controllers would have. This is a sense of powerlessness, of believing we have no ability to influence the circumstances we are experiencing. So worldview poisoning works to convince you that change is impossible and that you do not possess the power to influence others for the better. So let's break these down a little bit. First, the goal is the belief that human nature is generally flawed, that we are bad and evil, that this is how all humans are born, no exceptions. Despite what we've been indoctrinated to believe, at the beginning of life, there's actually very little nature in humans. The mindsets, belief systems, and behavior that we have throughout our lives are largely a function of what nurturing we receive, not our nature. So if nurturing is really the issue we should be focusing on, and human nature is just a simple set of instinctive behaviors and urges, mainly centered around survival of all things, have we been fooled into buying an entire narrative that human nature is some dominating, unchangeable force hardwired into us and forever governing our behavior? That human nature is the cloud that we can never get out from under, always darkening our psyche? I would bet that if you played a game of word association using the terms psychology or psyche or psychoanalysis certainly, or even I think human nature, I suspect that would elicit the response of Sigmund Freud from many people, if not most. And I don't think it's any stretch to say that Freud has been pushed as the voice in that field. So let's learn a little bit about his view of human nature, because it seems to have informed us, right? So I found this piece which seems to be authoritative, and it's kind of a summary of Freud's view on human nature. His deductive argument entails his conclusion that man is bad, or as Freud explains it, as homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. Freud's view of man is an evil one, and that all men are innately evil and aggression lies within the human as a part of his nature. Our inclination to aggression is apparent in one's relation with his neighbor and is apparent in everyday casual behavior. Freud also introduces the restrictions set forth by civilization to control the aggressive inclinations of man. Freud also said, "In the depths of my heart, I can't help being convinced that my dear fellow men, with a few exceptions, are worthless." He also wrote, "The virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life." Wow. But have we been directed to a particular and very narrow perspective on the topic of human nature? Is it possible that we've been led to a certain worldview that benefits the proselytizers of that message because it's in their interests? So I had a long conversation with my good friend David over the weekend, and we talked about this very subject, interestingly enough. It's something we have covered before and revisit from time to time, and I think it's probably because we have differing views, yet I think we both grapple with it to a certain extent in our own ways because of what we witness in the world around us, though I think the causes are the critical feature there. So David leans to a more negative view, and admittedly so. But in the conversation we had on Sunday, he really stole the show with this one. He asked, "Is human nature communicated to us such that we are manipulated into behaving in a way that is advantageous to our controllers and is against our own interests?" Well done, David. So what do you think? Nature or nurture? So once again, the emotional objective is fear, because without laws, regulations, controls, enforcement, force, and all of the tools of coercion the state has, the world we're indoctrinated into believing would face us is that of insurmountable chaos and danger. But let me ask you this question. What's your feeling about the level of order and safety that you experience in your world? Not the danger and the chaos, but order and safety. And I ask that because I think we've been fooled yet again. We've not only been deceived into a state of fear to the point where practically everyone has willingly relinquished their sovereignty, but my sense is that the result for most people has been experiencing more chaos and danger than order and safety. So then, is there human nature outside of very basic instincts of self-preservation? Or is what we've been led to believe is human nature is intentionally manipulated, and it's really the culminations of a person's experiences, of their nurturing? The teaching of the major world religions, and certainly Christianity, is that commonly held worldview of us as dirty, unwashed sinners who, if left alone, would turn into full-fledged animals without the intervention of those benevolent souls who claim to know and communicate with God. The cause of this thinking is not the condition we're in when we emerge from the womb. It's the condition of our nurturing. It's the lack of authentic, morally centered guidance and education, particularly of the young. And let's not confuse true morality with its fashionable lookalikes. Now, I'm talking about the fear God, respect your oppressors, strictly missionary style, typically white male zealots Who wouldn't know what real sovereignty was if it was handwritten on a message from Jesus and tucked away in their Bible? And again, here we have an interesting word we should look into: morality. I think Lysander Spooner gives us the best way to look at the morality of the day, which is wrapped up in opinions, beliefs, and dogmas about vices, or even what you and I may think are completely revolting behaviors. But that doesn't make them immoral, and for that simple reason, they should be completely off limits to any attempts at restrictions. And I may break this down in more depth at some point in the future, but I can't leave this without discussing one of my favorites, and that is the 7 deadly sins. So right there in the Bible, it says so. But my question to you is whether you think it's true. Is being gluttonous really a mortal sin? Death for eating too much? How about lust? Greed? Sloth? Wrath, envy, pride? Seriously? Now I get that they were a big deal for Kevin Spacey's character in the movie Seven, but come on. So then, do you think it's possible that these allegedly deadly sins are but another example of how our worldview of morality is distorted for the purpose of mind control? And if so, what do you believe is the cause of that distortion? Is it someone or some group doing something to you? Or is it a result of people having slowly, over a very long period of time, allowing themselves to be separated from their true nature and purpose? And though I always hold us, you and me, ultimately responsible for what is happening, what do you think about the character and the nature of the people and institutions that propagate that belief system? Do you think that is accidental? Just the misplaced efforts of the otherwise well-intentioned? So to human value, how is a person's worth or value determined? What makes a person worthy or valuable? Is it this? Because clearly, popular wisdom is that it's denominated in money and possessions. But the truth, the real truth, is that a person's worth is determined by how morally they behave. And I can tell you that a lot of people who meet the materiality and money tests fail this one categorically. So our worldview of humanity is again being distorted. It's being poisoned because we reduce the value of human beings to materiality, which increasingly pushes a larger group into the not valuable category. And what of change? Those pushing this agenda poison the mind with the belief that change cannot occur. And we desperately need that change in the world because things look grim. It needs to start with us throwing off the yoke of the conditioning that's been ground into us year after year. It's to get us curious about the nature of things, of seeing knowledge that shines a light on the truth of true cause and effect. What causes the effect of what we experience? To start that hard task of shifting those two forms of personal currency we have, time and attention, to truly worthwhile tasks. This is taking control of our thoughts and emotions to produce different, probably uncomfortable at first, action in the world. Isn't it interesting that we're encouraged and even rewarded for getting out of our comfort zones, is the current term, particularly in the workplace, but never in the realm of our belief systems, because those are sacred to the controllers. Their goal is to own that territory, your mind. So it's imperative for us to remember that change is possible, not easy, but possible, when we take back the creative powers of our minds. Together with natural law and our fellow beings, we are the co-creators of our experience. Curiosity and the continuous acquisition of knowledge is required because our controllers are very motivated and educated. These must converge. Our consciousness, which is our thoughts, emotions, and actions, combined with intelligence and care. and those combined with will and courage. And those can create something different. Now, that initial step is in an act of will, in a genuine desire to cause change in the world. So let's close this out with another quote from Lysander Spooner. Now, I was flipping back through my iPad, interestingly enough, and found this. I'd taken a screenshot of this back in May. And I can't cite the article or book it's from, but I think it's perfect for what we've been covering. Children learn the fundamental principles of natural law at a very early age. Thus, they very early understand that one child must not, without just cause, strike or otherwise hurt another, that one child must not assume any arbitrary control or domination over another, that one child must not, either by force, deceit, or stealth, obtain possession of anything that belongs to another, that if one child commits any of these wrongs against another, it is not only the right of the injured child to resist, and if need be, punish the wrongdoer and compel him to make reparation, but that it is also the right and the moral duty of all other children and all other persons to assist the injured party in defending his rights and redressing his wrongs. These are fundamental principles of natural law, which govern the most important transactions of man with man. Yet children learn them earlier than they learn that 3 and 3 are 6, or 5 and 5 10. Their childish plays, even, could not be carried on without a constant regard to them, and it is equally impossible for persons of any age to live together in peace on any other conditions. So that'll do it for this one. Thanks for joining me. And as always, remember, do your own thinking. Until next time, be well.